Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana, Serafin, also Senior Fellow at Carnegie Council. Welcoming today in a bit, Uzair Younus, the Director of Pakistan Initiative for the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center, who's going to speak with us about headlines that are not top of mind here in the US, but really link the world of what is going on with rulers trying to keep power, which we know a little something about here in the US, Nick. And can you take us through, as a setup, what's going on? There's so many elections going on around the world, and everything is sort of leaning right, or not? Tell us.
I think what we saw, obviously, we've just had the re-election of Viktor Orban and his party and the Fidesz party in Hungary against an effort of a coalition of left and right parties to try to unlodge him. There was a great deal of Western support for the opposition to try to end this period of illiberal democracy or illiberalism in Hungary. And in fact, Hungarian voters at the polls not only returned Orban to power, but increased the margin of victory for Fidesz, which really speaks to this idea that populism may not be as exhausted as some people have been predicting, that the populist wave is crest. We're seeing very interesting trends in France where Emmanuel Macron is still leading in polls, but has been dropping, and Marine Le Pen has been gaining, and that the likelihood that when the French hold their election, they will have to go to a runoff in which Le Pen again will be a formidable challenger. So it speaks to questions about resilience of democracies, but also the resilience of small L liberal parties against populism, against the attractiveness of populism, at a time when we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have all of the spillover effects around the world in terms of rising prices for food and fuel, and therefore spilling over into economic slowdowns. We had our a guest we've had on a number of times with us at the Doorstep, Rachel Ziemba, has been tracking what's happening with sanctions. Another one of our guests, Carolyn Kissane, writing very much about what's happening with European economies in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and a willingness to say sanction Russia, being balanced against the desire by politicians not to inflict too much economic pain on their constituents. That's certainly a backdrop in the French elections. It was backdrop to Orban's victory. And as we're hearing, these are not just simply issues connected to Europe, but very much across Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America. Politicians who are worried about the economic impacts of the Russian invasion and aren't as quick, perhaps, as the United States might like to join in condemning Russian action.
And I think this impacts very much what's going on in Pakistan on the domestic level, and the tie between domestic politics and foreign policy is so strong and can be so strongly seen there, and is going to reverberate here too as we look ahead to midterms. But right now, I'd love to go to Uzair for his fascinating comment. Thank you so much for joining us, Uzair. We are in the middle of breaking news. So we recognize that as we're talking today, right after things might happen. But one of the reasons we asked you to speak with us is because we feel here at Carnegie Council that we need to get behind some of the headlines that aren't getting enough attention. The world is big. Global North is very much focused on the Russia-Ukraine war. There's a lot happening in other places. What drew me to the story about what's going on in Pakistan, and I'll have you laid out, but primarily is because there is this blame going on the US. And I think that we need to understand what is Pakistan blaming the US for? What's going on? If you could lay out for us, that would be amazing.
Thank you for having me. And I'll start with the fact that this is connected to the Russia-Ukraine war as well. So while the US has a history of intervening in Pakistan's domestic politics, the most recent overt attempt was made in 2007, 2008, when General Musharraf, the dictator, was on his way out. At that time, the George Bush administration, Condoleezza Rice and others were having conversations with leadership, civilian and military, with Pakistan in terms of what that democratic transition ought to look like. So it's not that the US has not intervened in Pakistan's domestic affairs. It has a long history. The most recent conspiracy or foreign plot, quote unquote, which is outlandish by the Prime Minister, by outgoing Prime Minister Imran Khan, is that he received a cable from the top diplomat in Washington, Ambassador Asad Majid Khan, who is now the ambassador to Europe in Brussels, that said that he had met over a dinner or a meeting with Donald Lu and had a wide-ranging conversation. And in that conversation, allegedly, a threat was made saying, according to the government and the prime minister and his interlocutors, that the United States basically conveyed a message that this vote of no confidence that is in parliament, where parliament is exercising its constitutional right to oust a prime minister, is going to have repercussions on the relationship. And what they said that was that the repercussions would be that if the vote of no confidence succeeds, i.e. Imran Khan is no longer prime minister, all the past issues in the relationship will be quote unquote forgiven. And if Imran Khan remains prime minister, the relationship will be in a terrible sort of situation. And so Prime Minister Khan, in one of his rallies a couple of weeks ago, waved a letter, and he said, I have this letter that proves that there's a conspiracy and the opposition are traitors and they're conspiring to oust me. That really started a sort of debate in Pakistan, where the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, the Prime Minister's party, began blaming the United States. The opposition and others, including the security establishment and background conversations, made the case that there was no such evidence, but the debate continued. Fast forward to this past Sunday, which is when the vote is supposed to happen in Parliament. Parliament convenes, everyone's glued to their screens, and the law minister, who was made law minister just a day before the vote was supposed to happen, gets on the floor of the House and says that Article 5 of the Constitution says that we are all supposed to be sort of loyal to the Constitution, and there's a foreign plot. And so Mr. Speaker, who's the deputy speaker, was presiding this assembly session. What do you think about this? And very quickly, the deputy speaker got up and said, because there's a conspiracy and a foreign plot, the motion to move a vote of no confidence is rejected. And he said this all in so quickly, it happened within a matter of minutes, that the statement he was reading off of actually did not have his name. It had the name of the actual speaker, not the deputy speaker. And he read the name of the actual speaker and dissolved Parliament. The opposition has been protesting since then. They've gone to the Supreme Court to argue that this was an unconstitutional decision. And Pakistan, as we speak, is in the midst of a constitutional crisis. There is no federal government, and the Supreme Court is imminently going to make a decision on whether or not the speaker's ruling was constitutional or not.
Now, I noticed you said that Prime Minister Imran Khan is already ousted. Do you think, or what are your predictions of how the Supreme Court is going to rule, and will that be accepted?
Well, let me add some context to why I say he's ousted. So after the decision was made, Prime Minister Khan went on live television and said that he is asking the president of the country to dissolve the lower house of parliament, the National Assembly, and that the government stands dissolved. So there is no cabinet. But there is a stipulation in the Constitution where the president may ask the prime minister to remain as prime minister while there is the caretaker process moves, the constitutional process for elections moves forward. So he is still prime minister, but technically from a legal perspective, but he clearly lost the confidence and the majority that he had in parliament, which at this point stands dissolved. So my view on this is that the country is looking at early elections. The Supreme Court of Pakistan has a history of, which is in legal terms called the doctrine of necessity. It goes back to the 50s, where the Supreme Court has often said that in the greater national interest, a coup is okay, breaking the constitution is okay, getting rid of assemblies is okay because we move far into the process, so let elections happen. So I think that the indications at this point are, and there's a lot of confusion still, that we are looking at early elections. And the reason why we're looking at early elections is because Pakistan is also in the midst of an economic crisis at this point. The country has 2 months worth of imports left. The IMF program is in a state of flux. It's basically paused at this point. Pakistan's Eurobond yields are through the roof. Through the roof. Its credit default risk is through the roof. And so it needs a reversal of policies that Khan rolled out over the last month, including a cut and then a freeze to petroleum prices. So at this point, Pakistan's petroleum prices do not reflect the market price out there. So whoever comes next has to reverse all of that. That costs political capital. So I think the Supreme Court may say, why don't all of you just move towards elections, bring in a caretaker setup to sort of stabilize the situation politically and economically, and then let's look forward. But a lot of lawyers are also arguing that that's not the business of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court should put an end to this doctrine of necessity, weighing its judgments in the national interest, and just look at the Constitution. And constitutionally, what the Deputy Speaker and what the Prime Minister did on Sunday was unconstitutional, and they need to roll back and restore the assembly.
You raised the point of petroleum prices, fuel prices in Pakistan, and of course that ties us directly back to the fallout from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also in how the United States has been encouraging countries, not just simply its Euro-Atlantic and G7 partners, but really the global South as a whole, to join it in isolating Russia through economic sanctions. And yet, particularly in South Asia, the reaction has been that, as you said, fuel, food prices, the question of domestic economics, and that while the invasion of Ukraine is a European tragedy, it's not necessarily South Asia or Africa's responsibility to take the hit for pressuring Russia when countries depend on Russia for food, for fuel, for critical raw materials. How is this playing out in the context of the governmental crisis in Pakistan, the kind of U.S. demands on Pakistan, on India, on a variety of China and others to really interrupt their trade with Russia over Ukraine, even perhaps as you pointed out, at the cost of very clear domestic issues about food and fuel prices, which are core doorstep issues for politicians in any country?
Well, so look, on the Pakistan-Russia side, the issue that Imran Khan as prime minister sort of, argued why there's a foreign plot by the US is because he has tried to reach out to Russia in the last few weeks. And Pakistan's outreach to Russia has been in the works for a long period of time, primarily because of the need to balance its relationships as the US gets closer to India. So Pakistan needs to find other friends that it believes are going to be in its own strategic friends in the long term. So Imran Khan met Vladimir Putin at the Winter Olympics in China. He subsequently agreed to visit Moscow. He was in Moscow the day the invasion began. And so he's claiming that the United States is punishing Pakistan for his outreach to Russia, the neutrality it has had in terms of the votes at the United Nations and so that's the argument. On the energy side, Pakistan does not buy any significant amount of Russian oil. In fact, its refineries are not equipped to refine Russian oil. It's mainly a purchaser of energy from the Gulf. So it doesn't impact the country in the sense that it's not like India, which is seeking to buy Russian oil at a discount or things like that, because it's not set up to do that. Where it is having an impact is higher energy prices. The wheat output this year has been lower than expected. So there is the expectation that Pakistan has to go into the wheat markets. When it did that 2 years ago, the most significant contributor for Pakistani wheat imports was Russia and Ukraine. And so there's that problem. Fertilizer prices are through the roof, which has a medium-term impact on the next harvest season in terms of what farmers can afford. And so really that's the Russian sort of dynamic in Pakistan is the prime minister has argued that I am pursuing an independent foreign policy and Pakistan is being made to pay a cost and my government is being overthrown because of that independence.
How is this playing out on, on the, street level, in terms of anti-American sentiment, what do we need to be concerned about here in the US about this feeling and this supposed conspiracy?
Well, look, Pakistan is no stranger to anti-American sentiment. Just over the years, if you look at Pew surveys, anti-American sentiment has always been there. It has grown since 9/11 and the war on terror because of the blowback Pakistan had in terms of drone strikes and terror activities and stuff like that. And just a couple of days ago, Gallup did a snap poll where one of the questions was related to perception on the US, and the majority of the respondents in that poll, even though it was a snap poll, said that they view the United States as an enemy, not as a friend. So there is this long-term issue. Having said that, it is also important to understand that among the elites in Pakistan, there is a broad recognition that the US and Europe are important partners, strategic partners, not only because of economic reasons. The vast majority of Pakistan's exports go to the United States and the European Union, but also because of cultural diaspora and investment ties, which are far deeper than, let's say, with China or Russia in terms of the time period and the time horizon, the fact that people have relatives living in the United States and in the European Union more so than they do in Moscow or Beijing, for example, right? So there is that recognition to balance that out. And we saw this sort of come out in full in the open a few days ago at the Islamabad Security Dialogue, that while the Prime Minister and his government were making an argument for an independent foreign policy, why the outreach to Russia is important, the chief of army, perhaps the strongest man in the country at this point in time, very openly said that the relationship with the United States is strategic, that it needs to be deepened, and that Pakistan must consider Western interests. And in fact, to my understanding, this was the first time where a senior Pakistani official had ever come close to condemning Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. And I think it's important to understand the fact that Pakistan, while some Pakistanis argue that neutrality is the best path forward, I disagree. And the reason for that is that if Pakistan looks at the logic that the Russians have put forward of why they've invaded Ukraine, a lot of those things can apply to Pakistan in sort of opposition to an India, which is belligerent, which may argue that culturally there was no such thing as Pakistan, so you're the same as me, that your security relationships with China undermine my national security sort of interest as India because of a 2.5 front war. And so it is also important for American interlocutors privately to make Pakistanis understand that point, that standing up with the Ukrainians in this instance is actually in their own national security interest, because tomorrow, if a larger power, India, invades you using similar logic, you need to go back to the UN to seek protection. So you might as well stand up with the Ukrainians today so that somebody else might stand with you tomorrow.
That is a fascinating argument, and I wish was a stronger one. And I'm thinking about Zelensky up front of the UN saying, what are you here for if you're not going to do anything? Dissolve yourself. And so I'm wondering, what is the view of the UN from Pakistan?
Well, so from Pakistan, the view has always been that, Pakistan has been a contributor to the UN. It has worked through the UN system. It has demanded that the UN play its role in resolving the Kashmir conflict, which has been going on for decades. And so that view has always been there, and the Pakistanis have been arguing for that. Where they have shied away so far is that they're not willing to go out and condemn Russia in sort of the same strong language that perhaps the United States or Europe would like them to do. The problem has been, in a way, that while the US and Europe may accept that, as they have accepted with a lot of global South countries, particularly in South Asia, this sort of reaching out to Putin while he was invading and all of that has complicated matters. So I think Pakistan is trying to balance that out, both at the UN level and at the bilateral level. But it is finding it really difficult at this point in time because there's a political crisis domestically and foreign policy is at the center of that scandal.
You know, usually the United States media pays attention to Pakistan only in the context of problems, and particularly for many years in the US mind, Pakistan and Afghanistan were linked together. Since the US withdrawal from Afghanistan last year, Afghanistan has largely dropped off the US media coverage. We don't hear about it. Yeah, we've moved on. Obviously, Pakistan can't move on in the same way simply by reasons of geography. But to what extent is the current situation in Afghanistan creating or feeding into the domestic crisis in Pakistan? And does it also feed into a sense that Pakistan has been abandoned once again by the United States, just as it did after 1989, 1991? That the US walks away from Afghanistan and essentially leaves Pakistan with the bills to pay. Is there a sense that that is feeding into some of this anti-Americanism or concern about the US role?
Well, definitely that has played a role for decades and it continues today. And the Pakistani argument is that Afghanistan should not be forgotten, that the West and the international community ought to do more to help stem the humanitarian catastrophe that's unfolding there. And that Pakistan for decades has been generous, even though it's a poor country. It has openly hosted millions of Afghan refugees, many of whom are now in their second and third generation being born in Pakistan. I personally, where I live in my family home in Karachi, the back alley of my home has Afghan refugees living there at this point in time. I was just there past September. So Pakistanis have been generous. The government of Pakistan has been generous, but this creates domestic issues in the sense that there's resource constraints. Not only that are there resource constraints, the crisis in Afghanistan since last year has meant that there is a higher demand for wheat, for example, into Afghanistan. That gets smuggled from Pakistan, which is already struggling with wheat shortages, for example. The stoppage of dollar flows into Afghanistan means that dollar demand in Pakistan's black markets goes up. So, for example, right after August last year, while the Pakistani rupee was available for about 160, 70 rupees a dollar in the Karachi open markets, in the black markets of Peshawar, it was available for 180, 185 rupees to the dollar because there was a need across the border for the currency. So it has an economic impact. It becomes a challenge for a state that is already struggling domestically. And the Pakistani view always has been that the United States cannot abandon the Afghan people and Afghan refugees and must come to their aid and assistance. And if it doesn't, it creates not only issues for Pakistan, but for the broader region. Iran is hosting millions of refugees. The stans in Central Asia are hosting them. And as Afghanistan continues to face this catastrophe, the more sort of selfish interest for the West in particular is that ISIS is finding safe havens there. And that's a collective threat for the region and for the world. And so the only way to sort of resolve this situation is for the West to remain engaged, for the United States to take a leadership, and for humanitarian assistance to flow, not only because it's the right moral, ethical thing to do, but also because it serves the strategic interests of the global community.
You mentioned the U.S. role. Is there a role for China, and what role is China playing in even looking at the domestic politics and what's going on?
Well, so the Chinese have been watching the unfolding crisis in Pakistan at this point in time. About 30% of Pakistan's total external debt is owed to China. So they have a financial interest in stability of the country as well. The China-Pakistan economic corridor is continuing to make progress. New investments have come in, although they've slowed down over the last couple of years for various reasons. But the Chinese don't overtly sort of influence the sort of political the developments in Pakistan and in other countries like Sri Lanka, for example. But they are concerned. And they would like this situation to be resolved, and they would want stability to come back to Pakistan as soon as possible. They have also increasingly become concerned about the uptick in terror attacks in Pakistan. So year on year, terror casualties for security forces are up about 40% in the western regions of the country. Wow. That's where attacks have also taken place on Chinese engineers and workers working on the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So they've started talking about counter-terror cooperation, concerns about security in Pakistan in public statements as well. But the Chinese consistently have said that the relationship with Pakistan is ironclad, it's strategic, and China will stand by Pakistan. And so we will see my guess is once this political crisis sort of comes closer to resolution, that the Chinese will provide some immediate bilateral financial assistance to Pakistan. And it's likely that the Saudis and the Emiratis may do something similar as well. But definitely the Chinese will step in to help stabilize the economy.
How has the Biden administration been? I mean, here we are dealing with a lot of issues. And we're talking about anti-American sentiment, but really America is represented by Biden. And I know that Khan had a good relationship with President Trump. What is the relationship with President Biden, and what can we do more of?
Well, there is no relationship with President Biden. And that ultimately, some people have argued, is at the core of why Khan is insisting that there's a foreign plot as well, because Pakistani interlocutors publicly and privately often raise the point that President Biden never called Imran Khan. Even though he's called other world leaders. And so the prime minister sort of took offense or was, did not like the fact that he's been rebuffed for so long. Having said that, while there hasn't been head of state sort of, higher senior level engagement at that level, Secretary Blinken has engaged with his counterparts in Pakistan. Secretary Zia was just in Pakistan at the OIC meeting, had meetings with leadership of Pakistan at that trip. So senior level engagement sort of at the State Department diplomatic level have continued. Pakistani representatives have also come to Washington and had meetings both on the security and on the diplomatic side. So foundationally, things are progressing. But there is this view in Washington that Pakistan played a double game in Afghanistan for so long, and therefore it should not have that same level of access and friendliness in Washington that it used to have. So there are real issues that both sides need to solve for and resolve. Unfortunately, the problem now is that because this foreign plot has been inserted into the domestic politics, whoever comes next in Pakistan will find it very hard to reach out to the United States, not because the US may be unwilling to engage, but primarily because any strategic engagement in the near term will be seen by the Khan government and his supporters as evidence of the plot itself. Like, look, they changed the regime and now they're opening their arms in terms of greeting them, right? So it will be a very tricky sort of thing for both the security establishment in Pakistan as well as whoever succeeds Khan to navigate, because it's sort of, always any major headlines in terms of friendliness will be seen as evidence of a conspiracy.
That's so fascinating because, when we're looking at how domestic issues and foreign issues play out, it's all about messaging. And so I want to take you to, we talked about these top level connections. And you mentioned the diaspora, which has become such an important force in the Ukraine-Russia war, right? The Ukrainian diaspora is pretty much funding the war. What have you seen in the diaspora reaction here? How are they communicating? Is there a lot of chatter on social media one way or the other in support of one way or the other? And how is the diaspora affecting internal domestic politics. I find this a fascinating issue because social media is linking diasporas from around the world in such different ways. And so, I really want to talk about that aspect because I think that it's an aspect that many people don't necessarily see as a geopolitical force, but I think it should be looked at.
Yeah, well, the diaspora is sort of the most important stakeholder in the US-Pakistan relationship. They are educated, integrated into American society, take a lot of interest both in political developments here at home, but also in Pakistan. And so they've played a key role over the last few years to sort of build those bridges culturally, economically, diplomatically, and engage with Pakistani interlocutors to say, you know what, this is how perhaps you need to approach the relationship. They've also invested in technology startups in Pakistan, which is a red hot sector. There's a boom going on in entrepreneurship in the technology side. Much of that investment is being enabled through Pakistanis based here in the United States. But politically, when it comes to domestic politics in Pakistan, the diaspora is split. And I would say it's actually leaning towards Imran Khan. He's been very popular over the decades in sort of outside of Pakistan among the diaspora, especially educated upper middle class and middle class Pakistanis who have helped fundraise for his charitable hospitals, which is where he started his career as a philanthropist after he retired as a cricketer. Then his party in the early years, fundraising happened in the United States, in Europe, in the United Kingdom, etc. So they're really big believers in his message of change. But what we're seeing now is this conflict within the diaspora, because what they're seeing and what I'm hearing from them is that what happened on Sunday is essentially what Donald Trump wanted Mike Pence to do on January 6th. They're making that connection because they're saying the president lost. He wanted his vice president to stop the vote. He did not do that. And we think the Constitution reigns supreme in the United States. But in our homeland where we were born and where we've immigrated from, a prime minister was about to lose the vote and he stopped the count and ripped the Constitution to shreds. That may not be the majority view in the diaspora, but that is clearly a conflict within the diaspora that says, you know what, we benefit from living in a secular and constitutional democratic society. Perhaps the country of our birth should follow that example as well.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens. I know we're anxiously awaiting what the Supreme Court says, but I do think it's important to note the example that this sets for other leaders around the world, because we're living in a time of many elections coming up, around the world, and leaders kind of looking at what they can do or not do, and I want to kind of leave off with the idea of, what kind of example do you think this sets in the region? Is it an outlier, or can we expect this kind of strong man, maybe woman one day, armsmanship, in kind of taking power and saying, no, I'm not letting go?
Well, there is an authoritarian leader who happens to be a woman in the region. Her name is Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh, right? And so the region has been turning towards right-wing authoritarianism for a number of years. Prime Minister Modi in India and his BJP is an example of that. And so Pakistan is at this inflection point in the sense that the history of its Supreme Court is pretty dodgy when it comes to standing and upholding the Constitution. And so what a lot of people, including myself, have been arguing is that this is the moment for the Supreme Court to dry clean itself and wash away its past sins. Because if it stands with the Constitution today, it will set a precedent that says, you know what, Pakistan is making that journey towards constitutional democracy where norms and laws are upheld by the courts, and that strong men cannot get away with doing things such as what Imran Khan did on Sunday. We will see where this goes, but my firm belief is that if that happens, Pakistan will be one of those countries that will indicate to the rest of the world that perhaps it is okay and possible to resist authoritarianism, even though it causes a lot of social, domestic, political instability, but that it is possible. And I think Pakistan was also a first mover in terms of the age of populism, because Imran Khan has been a populist leader since 2013 at the very least, in terms of his public persona, the protesting, calling out the system of elites, etc. And so Pakistan can also be the first mover now in terms of restoring the belief that constitutions matter, that the rule of law matters, that democracy matters, and that the will of the people as represented in parliament, as flawed as that parliament might be, ought to be upheld. So this is a big inflection point, not only for the country's Supreme Court, but for the country itself and the world at large.
An excellent ending point. I couldn't have said it better. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.